everybody, and welcome to my puff quilt vlog. This is not going to be a tutorial. I have never made a puff quilt before. I myself will be following many tutorials. I've watched a bunch of YouTube videos. I did get the pattern from Lo and Behold Stitchery. I'm gonna need a lot of resources to complete this, but I'm just gonna film a little bit along the way so we can see how it goes together. The fabric. I am using this fabric, which I have been hanging on to forever. This is a collection from Hawthorne Threads from a long time ago, long enough ago that they were still Hawthorne Threads. Now they're called Hawthorne Supply Co. The pattern from Lo and Behold Stitchery says that you need 14 fat quarters, and I have 12 fat quarters, and some of them are going to be tough to use. Like, look at this one. So the puff quilt, like, it's little squares, and so I don't know if it's gonna look weird. You know, I wouldn't want a square that has like not all the butterflies, but you need the full fat quarter according to the pattern. So I'm not sure if that's gonna work out. Here's another fat quarter. Look, this one is really cute. It has these owls. It's darling. But you know, if I cut a piece out of this, it's just gonna look like weird stripes. So I might have to fussy cut some owls. This collection also came with a border print. So I have this big piece that has a border on each side, and it's not big enough to use as a border. This is one of the reasons that I've held on to this collection for so long, because I don't know how to use some of those fat quarter prints. I didn't know how to use that border, and we have some proper panels. So there's 4 long panels, and I like this nature scene. I like the style of the print. I never really know how to use panels, and this one has some strange sized ones. So it's time to use this collection, and also time to make a puff quilt. They're just coming together. So the first step is to cut up my fat quarters, and I'm gonna get started on that now. And I'm in trouble already. So for a fat quarter should measure 18 by 21 inches, and I have more than 21 inches, but I don't quite have 18 inches. And this is the measurement that I really need in order to get the right number of squares out of a fat quarter. So I don't think I'm gonna let that stop me. I'm still gonna use this fabric. I do have all that print from that border print, and maybe I'll just add some other fabrics of my own if I can't get enough squares out of my fat quarters. Guess what? I don't have enough fabric. Not only did I start with fewer fat quarters than the pattern called for, they were also smaller than I needed them to be. So I was not able to fussy cut the butterflies, I was not able to fussy cut the owls, and I'm going to have to cut up this border print like as if this is just another print, which I think will be fine. I do have a lot to work. Well, I have 2 more fat quarters here. It's still gonna be smaller than the pattern calls for, but I don't think that matters. So I'll add, I think I have some solids. I can add in a few of those, and it's just gonna be smaller than whatever the pattern said. But sewing the biscuits. Okay, let me get a darker fabric so you can see. The back of the biscuits is just scrap. This is very lightweight fabric that I got from a thrift store, and it's 1/2 inch smaller than the biscuit square. So you line up the bottom and top corners and sew a few stitches, and then you line up the bottom corners and just guess. Apparently you're supposed to eyeball where the middle is and form a pleat. You sew down that pleat and then turn the whole thing. Sew a few stitches, and then do the same thing on the other 3 or the other 2 sides. So we're sewing 3 sides shut and leaving 1 side open. I forgot another reason why I'd held on to this fabric for so long is that it's quite difficult to sew with, because Hawthorne Threads digitally prints their fabric, which is pretty good for the environment, but it has to be really tightly woven. And of course, this is not top quality fabric, so it's really, when you get started sewing, I changed my needle for a Microtex needle, but it doesn't matter. The fabric is so thin that it wants to get sucked down into the needle plate. It like sticks to the needle. I changed my needle plate too for a patchwork needle plate, so it just has a tiny little hole, but it's still happening. It's making this into kind of a slow process because every third time I try it, my fabric gets sucked below my needle plate. It will be better when, I think it will be better, at least for sewing, when I'm joining the rows together, because then there will be more layers of fabric, more thickness, and that's easier. That's not as likely to get sucked down into the needle plate the way that, like, this is really thin fabric and this is really fine fabric, and just not a good combo. I want this to be really light fabric though, because I'm already terrified that this thing is gonna be like a weighted blanket, especially if we put batting in it too. That's twice as many layers on the top as you would usually have, plus all that polyester stuffing. I think this is gonna be quite heavy. I guess we're gonna find out. Well, I changed my mind about the size again. So with the total number of biscuits I was able to get from my fat quarters, I could have just made a smaller quilt, but I didn't feel like I had enough variety really in the prints. Like, it was going to be hard to not have, you know, similar ones right next to each other. So I added some solid blues, some gray, and this yellow gingham, and now I need 13 more. I need 13 more puffs. I was thinking I could use green. There is green, just a little bit of green in some of the prints, but I think the solids really stand out. And so I don't know if that I want to introduce a brand new color solid. So I also have this lighter green. Those are similar colors. Okay, probably not green. I could do a gold. I have this print with these little bees, or I have kind of a darker gold. That might be closer. So I think I'm gonna go, I've already done blue, I've done gray. I think I'm gonna go for more gold. So the ombre puff quilt pattern has you like do a color fade. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to not have like these right next to each other. I also know that, oh look, now these is right next to each other. I also know that I can't be too particular because I just laid them out and already the dog has walked all over them. So I need to just pick them up and sew them together in rows. I don't have a good way to do that though, because I like to chain piece, and if it's in the row, like if you stack it in the row, then you can't really chain piece because you can't like run them through one after another. So thanks, really helpful. So I'm not sure how I'm gonna get them sewn together, but I am gonna have the goal that we don't have the same print next to each other, or you know, like a yellow one next to a yellow one, and I think that's about as good as I can do. Dog neglect. Got it on film. Alright, so I had them all laid out. I sewed like 3 rows, and then I didn't pick them up because I thought it was working well to just pick them up off the floor to sew the rows together. And they got all shuffled. So now, instead of laying them out again, because I really don't know how to chain piece if you have the rows like all stacked up, I don't know how you chain piece. So now I'm just gonna sew them into pairs and then maybe lay them out again. Or maybe I'll sew the pairs into 4s and then lay them out and try to not have anything the same touching. I think I have enough variety that this will work, but we're gonna find out. I got all of the rows together, and now it's finally time to stuff. The moment I've been dreading. Okay, so the process is row 1, you stuff the puffs and you pleat them and you sew them closed with like 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then the next step is you join an empty row. So right now I'm joining an empty row to a closed puff row. And then once you have the empty row joined on the left side to the closed puff row, then you stuff it and sew it closed. Then you join the next row. So you sew literally every single seam in this quilt is sewn 2 times. All 4 sides of every single puff is sewn twice. Something I have learned while sewing these empty rows to the puffed row is that you really do have to make the seam allowance bigger than 1/4 inch. Because if you line it up with the 1/4 inch, if I line it up with the 1/4 inch mark here, as I go forward, there's so much volume in here that the fabric is pulling to the left. So if I'm lined up at my 1/4 inch mark out here, by the time the fabric gets under my needle back here, all this volume running into the side of my foot pulls it this way. So I've had a few spots that I've had to go back and sew again because my seam allowance was so small that either I could see this 1/8 inch seam allowance that I'd sewn before, or in a couple places there was like an actual hole. So I'm trying to get this more over to like the 3/8 inch seam allowance. It doesn't matter what the measurement is, it just has to be big enough so that you don't have holes in the top. Another thing I have learned is that you really need a lot of space around your machine, and I wish I had a table here to the left. I have this drawer that I've been pulling out. You can't like bunch the quilt up as you sew it because it's very heavy and it doesn't move nicely when it's bunched. So if I was gonna make this any bigger, I would get out a table over here and maybe behind my machine too, because it really does have to stay pretty flat as you're sewing it in order to feed smoothly. Phew, all the rows are done. Okay. I originally wanted to put a border on this because I was terrified to bind these puffy edges, but now I'm terrified to put a border on it. Oh, you want to see the back? Of course you do. It's a train wreck. I think I flipped every single seam. Like, I was trying for a while to not flip seams, and I still managed to flip them. So I'm gonna I didn't want to use batting originally because it already is heavy and bulky, but I need batting to soften all those bulky seams on the back, and it needs to be like really puffy poly batting. So I gotta go find some of that. I have just barely enough poly batting. It's like a little, like it's just exactly the right size. So I'm just gonna go with that. If it doesn't reach all the way to the edges, it doesn't matter. And then I want to use these panels on the back, because what else am I going to use those panels for? So I think I need to cut them apart and then sew them back together in like one long line for the back. Well, of course it could not be as easy as cutting them apart and then sewing them back together, because they have these borders but only on one side. So like this was one line, and then there was another line between them, and then the other two, and then the top line. So I had to cut that middle blue zigzag in half in order to get them to be the same size, but now they're off, like where I sewed them back together. So I'm going to cut them all apart, and then I'm going to have to cut all these blue lines in half, and then I should be able to sew them back together. I have the top done. I joined 2 pieces of poly batting, so that's ready. And here's the back. Now, I guess we have to baste it. Lo and behold, Stitchery tied hers, and I would prefer not to tie mine, but I cannot imagine any other way to quilt it. So my question is, why are we basting it? Why don't I just tie it instead of basting it? I don't know anything. I should just follow the directions. Okay, I'm gonna baste it now. On to basting. Okay, I have like exactly enough of this polyester batting to make it work. So I should start in the middle and start basting out, but I was so worried about these edges not fitting on the batting that I'm trying to get the edges down first. I'm gonna go ahead and say that this quick clip pin baster thing is essential for this, because there's so much volume that you have to clip your pins through. That pin baster thing makes it so you can actually close your pins. And I didn't have it out for the first, I don't know, handful of pins that I put in, and it was so hard to pin. I got up and went and found it, because I think you need it for this. All right, so remember when we were doing these pleats and it just said to eyeball the middle of the square, and that's where you should put your pleat? If I ever make one of these again, I'm gonna mark, because like when they line up, like look, that one lines up perfectly, that one lines up perfectly, that one lines up pretty perfectly. Like I love that. That's my jam. This, ooh, I don't love that. I don't love that at all. This, come on. I didn't even get that close enough down in there. I like that one. I don't like, this is so off. This is way off. Oh my gosh. Oh, that one's nice. This one's nice. This one's nice. This one, I don't even know where the pleat is. Like, did I even pleat that? It's so off. It's way over here. You can't even see it. Yeah. I think eyeballing, like if you don't care about stuff like that, obviously it works fine. But I like it when stuff lines up. And I think you could easily mark. Okay, but now that I found this, I'm gonna fix it. So I have just a needle and thread here. And so what I've discovered while I was basting is that my line that was holding this pleat closed is larger than my seam allowance. And I don't really know how large my my seam allowance was. So I have a needle and thread here, and I'm gonna pop this into here. I'm gonna go get a thimble as soon as I get started, because this is very difficult to work a needle. It's this fabric, really. This fabric from Hawthorne Supply Flow. It's just quite difficult to sew through. Okay, so I'm just popping my, come on, I'm trying to pop my knot through it, but it's just so dense that I can't get my knot through. That's okay. So now I'm just gonna take a little bite out of here. I'm just gonna ladder stitch this closed, because I wanna make sure that I have enough seam allowance that it's not gonna like get a hole, because this feels high stakes. If you got a hole in the top of this, there would be stuffing coming out. That's not good. And this is a quilt that's for a little kid, so it needs to get washed a lot. So since I found this, I'm gonna fix it. I know it's not riveting content to watch, but I just want to show that it really does not take very much time to stitch this closed, and I'm gonna sleep so much better knowing that it's not maybe gonna bust open. This would have been a lot easier to fix had I noticed it before I added the next row of puffs, and then I could have just taken a deeper seam allowance from the back. It wasn't until I was about halfway through sewing that I realized that I needed to just be taking a deeper seam allowance the whole time. Because of all the bulk, it just pushes your seam smaller as you're going under the presser foot. Okay, so that's all. What was that? Just like maybe 10 stitches. And now you can't see that line. I'm just gonna tie this off on the top, maybe a little deeper. I know the lighting is not great, but If what you're looking for is a well-lit, well-produced video about making a puff quilt, you're just gonna have to keep looking. This is real life. We are on the ground at 10 p.m. on a Saturday night, stitching closed. There, look, I didn't even need to go get a thimble. It's all done. It's all done. I do have to go get scissors though. She's basted and halfway quilted because when I was trying to figure out the quilting, I did not stop to turn on the camera. The Lo and Behold Stitchery pattern tells you to hand tie the quilt. So I got pearl cotton. I'm ready to hand tie this quilt. I was thwarted by the fabric again. Hawthorne Threads, Hawthorne Supply Company, anybody that digitally prints on top of their fabric, it has to be a really tight weave in order to get the image to print nicely on top of the fabric. You're not, if you hand quilt, good for you. You probably don't hand quilt with pearl cotton on top of Hawthorne Supply Co. Or you have hands that are just like made of steel, because I really tried. I had thimble, I was like pushing, and then I had like tape on my fingers to pull through the other side. It's too thick, the fabric's too dense. There's no way I would have been able to do all the time. So what I'm doing instead is I'm using my sewing machine to do a tacking stitch. Now my machine has a few options for tacking stitches, and so I'll set the camera up so you can see what that looks like. Basically it just sews a whole bunch of times like in the same little area, and then when it's done I have the machine cut it off, and then I'm gonna go back and trim these little tips later. So let me try to set the camera up so you can see what that tacking stitch looks like. First of all, I recognize this is a computerized machine. If you don't have a computerized machine and you're trying to sew a puff quilt, you could still tack it like this. You could still tack any quilt like this. You just set it to a zigzag stitch and then go forward a few stitches and backwards and forwards and backwards, and then have long tails so you could cut it off later. This is a Memory Craft, Janome Memory Craft 7700, and I'm gonna like pick this like little, I don't even know what this is, like a satin stitch, and it wants to do a whole bunch of them in a row, but I'm gonna tell it just do one and then do a lock stitch. So this is the pattern that's gonna make. It's gonna make one little satin stitch, and then it's gonna make a lock stitch, and then that's gonna be the completion of the pattern. And then I'm gonna I'm gonna push the button to cut it off and then move the quilt to the next spot that I wanna tack. So I'm gonna show you what that looks like on my little scrap piece here, because honestly I don't know if I'm gonna be able to film once I have this giant quilt in. So I have a little scrap and then my batting. I'm holding the top thread. I'm gonna go needle down, needle up, and then that pulls up my bobbin thread, which I'm gonna grab with tweezers and like pull off to the side. So I hold these, then I'm pressing down my I'm pressing down my foot pedal, and it's gonna do the whole stitch pattern. First it's doing the satin stitch, and then it's gonna slow down and do the knot stitch. And now I'm still pressing down my foot pedal, but it's not stitching anymore because it's done with the pattern. So I'll let go of the foot pedal, I'll press the cut. It just cut it off from the back, and then you can see what the tack stitch looks like. That's from the front. I'm gonna go ahead and cut those threads, and that's what it looks like from the back. Oh, there's no light on it. Well, it looks fine. Not great, but fine. All right, I'll try for you. So here's my top thread. Press your foot down, needle up. It did not grab the bobbin thread, and this has been happening to me sometimes. Pull the bobbin thread out. Ooh. Satin stitch. Knot stitch. Cut. The reason that I hold these threads at the top is because if I don't, the bottom one will get all wrapped around the stitch on the back, and then it can make these little like loopies. So we've arrived at the next. I'm doing every other intersection. Maybe I'll come back and do the other ones. Somehow I doubt it. Okay, so needle down, needle up, pull up my bobbin thread, grab this, here we go. I'm over on the side now, so I don't have a ton of bulk underneath the machine throat, which is making this a lot easier. I was in the middle, oh man, that was brutal. Some of the savvier sewing machine users in the group might be screaming at the video that I could program it to just do the cut at the end of the pattern. So I could hit this button right here and then it would do one satin stitch, one lock stitch, and then cut. I am choosing not to do that because when I first put the needle down, needle up, I'm already eating into that satin stitch. Sometimes it takes me 2 or 3 stitches to get my bobbin thread to pop up on the top. And if I've already wasted half my satin stitch trying to get my bobbin thread to come up, I'll just run this program again. So like it'll do the second half of the satin stitch and then a lock stitch, and then I'll just press the foot pedal down again so it does another full satin stitch, lock stitch, and then I'll cut it. So that's why I'm choosing not to program the cut, because sometimes I want to do it twice. I am cutting these threads, and usually I would not just cut threads. Usually I would tie them off and then thread them on a needle and then bury the tails. And I feel like I should do that here, but also it feels like that would be crazy to do here. So I'm just cutting them. I'm trying to tell myself, like, when I want to rip something, when I want to unsew something, it's kind of hard. Like, stitches don't want to come unsewn. So these stitches should not easily come unsewn. But if they do come unsewn, I will let you know. I thought about putting like a little dab of fray check on each little satin stitch, but I did some research and it sounds like fray check is gonna make like a little crusty spot, which I would prefer not to have. So I'm just snipping them and trusting the process that stitches do not just come unsewn. It's gonna be fine. I still feel nervous. I trimmed all of the threads from the front, but I still feel nervous about trimming the short ones from the back, even though I did a knot stitch, I know. So I'm just gonna do some of my own research. I'm gonna put like a little bit of fray check on my sample stitches. Wow, that was way too much. I didn't mean to get the fabric wet. I'm gonna let this dry and see how crunchy it is. I might still do it on the back. Okay, while that dries, I'm going to get started on the binding. In the Lo and Behold Stitchery pattern, she does a stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge all the way around, and she leaves that in, like you're gonna be able to see that. And then she trims the batting right up next to the quilt and the backing 1 inch away so she can fold over. I don't want to see that lap of stitches all the way around. So I think what I'm gonna try is to do a basting stitch like way inside, like 1 inch inside, and then trim and plan on taking that basting stitch out later. Let's see if I can even do that. Well, I kind of can, kind of can't. So the reason I wanted to do this is because it's going to be very difficult to sew binding to this much mass, this much puffiness. But it's also difficult to sew, just a flat thing to that much puffiness. So if I ever make a puff quilt again, or if you are ever making a puff quilt, my recommendation would be on the sides, on the puffs that are on the sides, go ahead and sew like a giant basting section before you stuff them, and then like way overfill them in the middle, because once you have the puff stuffed, it's really, you cannot get the stuffing to like move into the left half of the puff so that you can sew over here. Like the polyfill is filling it to the edge. The next step is to trim the backing, which will become the binding, 1 inch away from the edges, which is gonna take some engineering, because like usually I would lay my ruler down and then trace 1 inch away, but a straight line, this is not. So maybe I'll put it like this. Of course my ruler has a crack in it because I dropped it on the concrete floor, and mark 1 inch away like a bunch of times and then cut. Also 1 inch folding twice seems like not very much. Maybe I'll just play fetch for a little while and think about it. Okay, I decided to try 1.5 inches. So I measured with a ruler that had 2 good sides, 1.5 inches away, a bunch of places along this side, and got a wild variety of marks that wouldn't connect in a straight line. But now I'm cutting that piece off, and I'm gonna try to fold it and then fold it again. I think it's gonna be okay. It's like a wider binding than I would usually do, but I would not usually make such a puffy quilt. So we're beyond normal bounds here. My verdict is that yes, this basting line is helping me. It could be helping me more if I'd put it in before I stuffed these puffs. Because now when I'm attaching the binding, so it's 1 inch, you fold it once, and then you fold the fold over, and that's what you sew down. And I still have some bulk to contend with, but the majority, like the biggest part of the puff at least, is pushed out of the way. So my presser foot can go more or less straight. The sad thing is that because there's so much volume, my stitches are super uneven. Like sometimes they're teeny tiny, sometimes they're normal sized. Right before the corner, they just get so small. It just looks messy. And maybe once I take out this basting line, it'll like puff up and kind of like spill over that. Somehow I doubt it. I think it's just gonna look like the side. Oh, I'm just disappointed. All right, the binding is on. I feel like the corners, each one got a little better, but none of them are great. So now I'm picking out this binding line. Well, I started picking it out and then I realized that would be a really good activity to do tonight while I'm just like watching TV, vegging out. So I checked on my fray check sample and I don't think it's too crunchy. Like it feels a little stiff, sure, but that's the point, right? So, and I think it will make me feel a lot better to put fray check on these before I trim these threads off. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna put just the tiniest little drop of fray check on all these little back sides of my tack stitches. And then once that dries, I'll clip those off. Okay, here we go, moment of truth. I gotta wash and dry it. I'm sending this to a family that has kids. It's for the kids, so it's gonna have to be machine washed and dried often. I want to do it the first time myself so I can kind of see if there's any places I'm worried about before I send it off to them. So I'm gonna wash it on delicate, and then I'm gonna dry it, probably just on like medium. We'll see how it goes. Ta-da! It's all done. I washed it, I dried it, I've looked carefully. I don't see any tack stitches that are coming undone. There's no place that I'm like worried about the stuffing, so I'm gonna send it off to its new home. My closing thoughts about this, I am glad that I tried it. I think every quilter should make at least one puff quilt, but if you're watching this, make a really small one, just like a little bitty one. I learned a lot. If I had to do it again, I would probably do some things differently, but I think one puff quilt is enough for me. My biggest disappointment is the binding. I don't think I could do this any better without planning ahead to have like a flat border or have basted without having puffs right to the edge beforehand. But all in all, it's puffy and it's a quilt. I made a puff quilt. Here's the back. I used those panels from the collection and then I supplemented with some fabric that I hand dyed myself. The tack stitches, I put fray check on them and then I washed them. They're not coming undone. I haven't found any that I'm worried about. They don't feel crusty at all either. So I think this is a fine method for machine tying a quilt. I hope they like it. Thanks everybody for watching. See you in the next one. Bye!